Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are looking at a shift on the world map that's happening right in front of our eyes. But somehow, it feels like the mainstream conversation is missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Global South. Now, I know what you're thinking. You hear that term, and you probably think it's just a polite, updated label for developing countries or, third world.
That's right.
Right.
Exactly. And for decades, that's exactly how the term was used. It was an economic bracket. It was a nice way of saying countries that aren't rich yet.
Right.
But what we are seeing now, and what the source material we are covering today really, really emphasizes, is that the Global South it's mutated. It's stopped being just a label for poverty and has started becoming a serious strategic category.
Strategic how?
It represents power, it represents autonomy, and honestly, it represents a massive headache for the old way the world worked.
And right at the center of this whole shift is India. The source we're unpacking today is titled Strategic Vanguard, India's New Global South Architecture. And it poses this massive central mystery that I want us to really dig into. Is India secretly, or maybe not so secretly, building a new strategic bloc to rival the West or China? Because when I look at the headlines, India seems to be everywhere at once.
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because when we usually think of blocs, we think of the Cold War, we think of NATO, we think of these rigid alliances where if you attack one, you attack all. It's a fortress mentality.
Us versus them.
Or we think of the Chinese model, which is very centralized. Everything radiates out from Beijing like spokes on a wheel. But the argument here is that we are witnessing a quiet strategic revolution.
A quiet revolution.
India isn't building a military alliance, and it isn't building a vassal state system. It's doing something much more fluid.
Fluid can be a nice word for messy, though. I mean, the mission for this deep dive is to figure out if this is actually a strategy or just chaotic opportunism. How is India redefining what it means to be a global power by, refusing to pick a side?
To understand that, we have to look backward before we can look forward. We need to talk about history, specifically the DNA of India's foreign policy.
Okay, let's unpack this history.
Yeah.
Because India has been playing the hard-to-get game for a long, long time. During the Cold War, they were the poster child for the non-aligned movement.
Right. And a lot of people misunderstand what that meant. They think non-aligned meant neutral, like Switzerland.
Just sitting on the sidelines, holding everyone's money, staying out of trouble.
Exactly. But that wasn't it at all. It wasn't about being passive.
So what was it then?
It was about strategic independence. The goal wasn't to hide. The goal was to actively reject the binary choice. They were saying, we refuse to be forced into a camp. If you were non-aligned, you could preserve your sovereignty. You could make your own foreign policy decisions without checking with Moscow or Washington first.
Which, let's be honest, was a pretty good play.
Yeah.
It allowed them to get steel mills to the Soviets and grain shipments from the Americans.
It was pragmatic. But today, the language has shifted. You won't hear Indian diplomats talking as much about non-alignment. That feels dated. Now, the buzzword you see in the source material is strategic economy, or sometimes multi-alignment.
Okay, multi-alignment. I have to use an analogy here because this concept feels very specific. It kind of reminds me of the shift from, say, traditional marriage to, let's call it an open network.
Go on.
Well, think about it.
Yeah.
In the old NATO model, the marriage model, you have exclusivity.
Yeah.
You get total protection, but you also have a total obligation. You can't just go have dinner with the Russians if you're married to the Americans.
Right.
But multi-alignment is like refusing to be exclusive. You hang out with the Americans for security on Friday because they have the best guns.
Yeah.
You hang out with the Russians on Saturday because they have cheap oil.
And do business with China on Sunday.
Exactly. You aren't cheating because you never promised fidelity to anyone.
That is actually a shockingly accurate way to put it. The core philosophy here is seeking partnerships without dependency. India remembers the Cold War. They learned a hard lesson.
Which was?
If you rely too much on one single power, you become vulnerable. You become a client state. If that power decides to squeeze you, you have nowhere else to go. So this modern strategy is about engaging with everyone to ensure that no single country has a hold over your destiny.
So we get the philosophy, keep your options open. But why is this happening now? Why is this Global South idea suddenly having this massive resurgence in the 2020s? Is it just because India is getting bigger?
That's part of it, but there was a specific catalyst, a moment where the rubber met the road.
What was it?
The war in Ukraine.
The source material really highlights this. It calls it an aha moment for geopolitics watchers.
It was the stress test for this entire theory. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the US and Europe imposed massive sanctions. And the expectation in Washington and Brussels was that, the civilized world would fall in line.
They assumed the global south would join the sanctions.
They absolutely did. And they didn't. By and large, they refused. A huge chunk of the global south just said, no thanks.
And that must have been a shock in Western capitals.
A huge shock. But for the global south, it wasn't about loving Putin. It was about frustration. They felt that when they had problems, pandemic debt, climate change disasters, the West was slow to help. But the moment Europe had a crisis, the whole world was expected to pay the price.
Right. I remember reading about the 3 Fs: food, fuel,
and fertilizer. The war caused prices for those 3 things to just skyrocket, which disproportionately hurts poor countries.
So it was a survival thing.
Exactly. So while the West was talking about democracy versus autocracy, the global South was talking about survival versus starvation. This disconnect opened a massive door. It highlighted the limits of Western consensus. And India saw this opening immediately.
They really ran with it during their G20 presidency, didn't they? I remember seeing the headlines. India wasn't just hosting a meeting. They were trying to brand themselves as the voice of the global South. But was that just a PR stunt? Or was there substance there?
It was actually very strategic. Before the main G20 summit with Biden and other leaders, India held a separate Voice of Global South summit. They gathered 125 developing nations and basically said, tell us what you need.
We'll take your shopping list to the big table.
It was brilliant diplomacy. They crowdsourced their agenda. They focused on debt reform, climate finance, technology access. They basically stood up and said, hey, while the big powers are fighting over ideology, who is looking out for us? That gave them massive diplomatic credibility.
But here is where I get skeptical. Because if you are a developing nation, say you're Kenya or Sri Lanka, and you're looking for a partner to help you build your country, there's another giant in the room.
China,
who has been courting the global South for a very long time.
Added with huge amounts of money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how is what India is doing any different from what China is doing? China builds bridges, ports, highways. You can touch them. Can India really compete with that?
This is the absolute crux of the argument in Strategic Vanguard. It is a battle of models. And to understand it, we have to look at the flaws in China's model. China's Belt and Road Initiative is largely about hardware.
Concrete and steel.
Concrete and steel, which sounds great if you need a road.
It does.
It is, until the bill comes due. These are often high-interest loans, and we've seen cases like the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka where the country can't pay the debt, and China ends up taking control of the asset.
So they create influence through debt.
It creates influence through debt dependency. It's a vertical relationship, big brother China and little brother debtor.
So China builds you a port, but then you owe them $1 billion, and they kind of own you. What is India's alternative? They don't have China's wallet.
No, they don't. So they aren't trying to outspend China on concrete. The source calls India's approach the third pathway. Instead of exporting hardware, India is focusing on capacity building and digital public infrastructure, or DPI.
Okay, digital public infrastructure.
Yeah.
That sounds like the most boring tech jargon imaginable. Why is that a strategic weapon?
I know, but it's about the operating system of a nation. Think about the India stack. India has built these massive, scalable digital solutions for its own population. Things like Aadhaar, which is a digital identity system.
And UPI, right? The payment system.
The Unified Payments Interface. I've read that it's actually way ahead of what we have in the US. Instant transfers, zero cost, using just a phone number.
Yeah, it's incredible.
It is light years ahead. Now imagine India goes to a developing country and says, we won't build you a road that cracks in 10 years. We will give you the code and the expertise to build your own sovereign banking and identity system.
Wait, that's actually huge. Because if you use Visa or MasterCard, you're relying on American rails. If you use Chinese systems, you're relying on Beijing's data servers.
Precisely. That is the aha moment. India is selling sovereignty. They are offering an open source model where the country gets to keep its own data and control its own financial pipes. It allows these smaller nations to modernize without becoming a vassal to China or the West.
It's software diplomacy versus hardware diplomacy.
And it's presented as South-South cooperation. It feels like a partnership between equals rather than a superpower buying loyalty.
That is surprisingly clever.
Yeah.
But let's look at who India is hanging out with, because this is where my brain starts to hurt a little.
Right.
We've talked about multi-alignment, but seeing it in practice is wild. On one hand, India is in the Quad with the US, Japan, and Australia. That is explicitly a security group to counter China.
Correct.
But on the other hand, they're in BRICS with Russia and China. How do they reconcile that? It feels like being in two rival gangs at the same time. How does the US not look at that and say, pick a side?
To the casual observer, it looks like a total contradiction. But the source material argues that this is not confusion. It is. It's design. It is that networked approach we talked about.
So they're doing it on purpose.
100%. By engaging with the Quad, they get security cooperation, intelligence, high-tech defense sharing to balance against China in the Indo-Pacific. They need that because they have a border dispute with China.
Okay, that makes sense.
But by engaging with BRICS, they keep a door open to the non-Western world.
But isn't BRICS becoming just a Chinese club? With Russia weak, isn't Xi Jinping just driving the bus?
That is exactly why India stays in BRICS. And this is a nuance the source really stresses. India is the internal counterweight.
Wait, so India is inside BRICS to stop BRICS from working?
Not to stop it from working, but to stop it from becoming what China wants it to be.
And what's that?
China would love for BRICS to become a purely anti-Western, anti-American bloc, a club of autocrats that exists to tear down the US dollar. India, however, pushes for it to be multipolar.
Okay.
They want BRICS to represent the developing world's economic interests, not just Chinese geopolitical grievances.
So they are the brake pedal.
Exactly. India supports expanding BRICS to include more countries like Egypt or Ethiopia because that dilutes China's voice. If India left, BRICS would likely turn into a full-on Chinese proxy. By staying, they force compromise.
That is a delicate tightrope walk. You're sitting at the table with the Chinese and Russians smiling, but under the table you're kicking their shins to keep them from taking over the whole meeting.
It's high-stakes diplomacy, and it extends beyond just meetings. Look at connectivity. We talked about China's Belt and Road.
Right.
India is pushing the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor.
The IMAC. That's the trade route plan, right?
Yes. A ship-to-rail network connecting India to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and then up to Europe. The significance here is that it creates a trade route that bypasses China completely.
It's about redundancy.
Yeah.
It's about not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. If you have multiple roads to market, you are safer. And frankly, so is a global economy.
And what about defense? Because usually when a country wants to be a power, they start selling fighter jets and tanks. Is India trying to become the next Lockheed Martin?
They are starting to export defense hardware, like the BrahMos missiles to the Philippines. But the core strategy is different. When major powers like the US or Russia sell complex weapon systems, it creates a lock-in.
Right. You buy the jet, you need the parts, the software updates, the training. You're married to them for 40 years.
Exactly. It creates dependency. India's defense diplomacy is focusing more on training, joint exercises, capacity building. They are going to nations in the Indian Ocean and saying, we will train your Coast Guard, we will give you patrol boats, we will help you secure your own waters.
So teaching a man to fish, rather than selling him a fish that only you know how to cook.
That's a good way to put it. They want to be seen as a reliable partner, not a hegemon. They are trying to build trust. If you are a smaller nation, you might be scared of China's Navy. You might be wary of the U.S. demanding a base. India is trying to position itself as the helpful neighbor who helps you lock your doors, but doesn't want to sleep on your couch.
This all sounds very strategic and smart, but I have to play devil's advocate here. We are painting a very rosy picture of this strategic vanguard, but surely there are roadblocks?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, India is growing fast, but its economy is still a fraction of the U.S. or China.
Yeah.
They have massive internal poverty. Can they really pull this global strategy off?
That is the reality check the source provides. There are significant obstacles. The biggest one is what analysts call the delivery deficit. It means promising big and delivering slow. India has a reputation for bureaucracy, red tape. If a developing nation needs a port today, China can deploy 10,000 workers and have it done in 6 months. India might take 6 months just to sign the Memorandum of Understanding.
Right, you can't eat digital sovereignty. Sometimes you really do just need the bridge.
Exactly. India simply cannot write the massive checks that China can. They don't have the capital surplus, so they have to rely on private companies or partnerships, and that's just slower. It's messier.
And there's diplomatic risk, too.
For sure. Balancing relations with rival powers, like staying friends with Russia while courting the U.S., requires constant maintenance. One wrong move, one sanctions violation, one border skirmish, and the whole multi-alignment tower could wobble. It's exhausting to maintain.
So let's go back to the question we started with. Is this a bloc? Is India building Team India to fight Team China?
The verdict from the experts is no, it is not a bloc. A bloc implies walls. It implies us versus them.
Right.
What India is building is a flexible coalition. It prioritizes cooperation over hierarchy. It prioritizes flexibility over rigidity.
It's a network, not a fortress.
Exactly, and that distinction is crucial. A fortress is strong, but it's brittle. If the walls break, you lose. A network is resilient.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about flexible coalitions and digital public infrastructure if you're just trying to understand the news?
It matters because we are moving toward a fragmented global governance structure. The old days where one or two superpowers dictated the rules for everyone, those are fading. India is acting as a quiet architect, reshaping the balance of power, particularly in the Indo-Pacific.
It feels like for the average person or even a business leader, this means the world is getting more complicated. You can't just look at a map and say blue team and red team anymore.
No, you can't. We are seeing a new model where nations, and specifically this rising global south, don't have to surrender their independence to get ahead. If India succeeds, other nations might follow this multi-alignment model. It changes everything.
It's almost like the democratization of geopolitics. Messy, loud, but maybe more representative of what the world actually looks like.
And potentially more stable in the long run, or more chaotic. That's the gamble.
Here is a final thought I want to leave you with, something to chew on. We spend so much time worrying about a clash of titans, U.S. versus China, democracy versus autocracy. We look for the explosion. But what if the future of global power isn't about who has the biggest stick? What if it's about who has the most connected network?
That is a profound thought.
If India succeeds in creating this networked alignment, this complex web where everyone is connected to everyone, maybe the quiet architect is actually the most disruptive force of all. Because you can't fight a web. You can only get tangled in it.
And in a world searching for alternatives, the one who builds the web might just end up running the show.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on this Strategic Vanguard podcast. If you found value in this analysis, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you fresh podcasts every Monday here on YouTube and Rumble, and you can also catch the audio versions on Spotify and Amazon Music. Just search for Strategic Vanguard Podcast. For more insights, articles, and discussions, subscribe to our blog at strategicvanguard.com. Your support helps us grow and bring you more in-depth analysis on defense, geopolitics, and strategy. Until next time, stay informed, stay strategic.